time to get into those personal experiences. And I don't know where to start, but I thought since you mentioned themes, images, insights, we could use that as a jumping off point, and you could start wherever you'd like to start, really. But I would be very curious to hear you describe any of your experiences that ended up being very meaningful for you.
Sure. Yeah. It's funny. I said earlier I approached my psychedelic journeys with a lot of trepidation, and I approached the writing of them with a lot of trepidation after the fact, because I didn't know that I could. It's a real literary challenge. If you think about how many trip reports you've read that were any good, you could count them on one hand. And so that was the kind of Everest I kept moving toward as I was going through the book. Is like, oh my God, I'm going to have to explain these experiences. In the event, it turned out to be great fun to write about. I really enjoyed writing about it. It was a challenge, but of the best sort. I had, just to give you the landscape of it, I had experiences with LSD. These are guided experiences with LSD, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT, and which is a pretty obscure psychedelic that's made from that is the smoked venom of the Sonoran desert toad. Yes, somebody figured that out. And then ayahuasca. A couple ayahuasca circles. I would say that for me, the most useful, insightful experience was a guided psilocybin journey, where I was trying to approximate the dosage being used in the above ground trials. I think I was a little shy of that. And I worked with a wonderful guide, a woman on the East Coast. And what can I say about this experience? What was really important about this experience was that I experienced ego dissolution for the first time. I had read a lot about it, non-dual consciousness, and I was curious to have such an experience, and also, very nervous about it.
Just to pause, sorry to interject. So non-dual meaning what? That means that you're no longer the observer?
Yeah. Normally, we're the subject, we're the perceiving subject, and everything else is the object of our perceptions, right? And we have this kind of split, and that kind of defines our consciousness to a large extent. And it's a rather selfish way of looking at things, but that's how most of us look, and probably many animals look at things that way too, although we don't have much rapport. But that non-dual consciousness is where that sense of separation breaks down, either because they're other subjects you're aware of. I've had an experience where the plants I realized they had a subjectivity too, and they were looking back at me in a sense, and that also tends to break down the sense of duality that we go through life with. So this happened. This wasn't always a pleasant experience. I took the mushroom. It was a very large mushroom that I ate with some chocolate, and she was kind of more in the shamanic style of guides, as many underground guides are. It really is you have a sense of ceremony more than you do in the above ground trials. Initially, one of the problems I've had with the underground guides is their musical taste, which is just horrible very often. I mean, to me, it's the kind of music that's fine if you're getting a really high quality massage at a top resort. But for a psychological experience, it seems a little wanting. And so she put on this piece of new age claptrap, and it immediately put me in. And I thought it was electronica. I thought it was electronic music. It turned out not to be. But it immediately put me in this space of a computer or video game. I was in a world that had been generated by computers, and it was dark and very sleek. It wasn't scary, but it was claustrophobic, and just I wanted to be outside. so there I was in this dystopian video game, going along and seeing, all these digitally created things, and I can imagine somebody who would enjoy this space, but it wasn't my space. And I asked her to change the music, and it got a little better. And as the experience moved on, I started to get a little anxious that, oh my God, I'm trapped in computer world. How can I get out of here? And but I remembered my flight instructions. That's a word used at Hopkins to describe what you're told in the preparation session, which is if you see anything scary, don't try to get away from it. Step right up to that monster and say, "What are you doing in my head?" or "What have you got to teach me?" And it's very good advice. Or surrender. Relax your mind and float downstream. All these mantras they give you, and they're actually really helpful. And I realized, all right, I just have to surrender to this. And I got deeper into the experience. And then am I going too slow in this narrative? Is this okay?
This is great. I'm in no rush.
Okay. And then it was very powerful for a while, and I was getting a little nervous about it. And I thought, I'm going to take off my eye shades. I'm wearing these eye shades. And one of the great things about the eye shades is they're a powerful technology. I mean, much more powerful than you can imagine, more powerful than VR, virtual reality, which is not that powerful. But, it sends you inside. So if you take it off, and I took it off just to make sure reality was still existing, and to reorient myself, and also because I had to pee. Suddenly I saw the room I was in, and the guide, and the plants, and the walls, and the furniture, and I was like, reality. I love it. But I had to pee, and I went to the. She escorted me to the bathroom because I could barely move. And when I came back, and I definitely didn't want to look in the mirror. I was really nervous of what I would see, and I didn't want to look at her either. And I was just like, I peed. I produced this, described as this spectacular crop of diamonds, because everything had this beam of light that was, being addressed directly to me. And then I came back and she said, "Did I want a booster dose?" And I said, yes. And I looked at her for the first time as she was kneeling next to me, and she holds out her hands, another mushroom, and she has transformed. She's normally blonde, and her hair had turned black, and she was this old Mexican Indian, and she had morphed into Maria Sabina, this legendary figure in psychedelic history, who gave Gordon Wasson, the first Westerner to ever try psilocybin, his ceremony in Oaxaca back in the 50s. And she had turned into this person, and her hands were leathery, and her face was stretched over her cheekbones. It was quite shocking, and I had to look away, and I didn't want to tell her what had happened to her. So I take this stepped up dose, and when I do that, and then I go back under and I put on the shades, the eye shades again, I have this sense of dissolution, that my identity has just exploded into 1,000 little slips of paper, like little Post-its. And I was watching it just get blown to the wind, but I wasn't panicking. I had no desire to reassemble, collect all the paper and put it back in a pile. It was like, no, this is fine. And I realized that that's what was happening, and there was nothing to be done but surrender to it, and that my sense of self was falling apart before my eyes. But what does that mean? How can your sense of self, who's my eyes? who's perceiving this? And then it got even more extreme, and I saw myself spread out over the landscape like a coat of paint or butter. And I was totally fine with it. That was the kind of most amazing thing. And I can't explain what exactly happened, because my ego was out there, but there was still an eye to take in the scene. And the lesson of it was that, what should have felt like this personal cataclysm, total loss of self, there was no category labeled personal anymore. And I was able to perceive this whole scene with this dispassionate objectivity. It was like, that's the way it is, unperturbed. And it was this I had access to this amazing vantage point. And it made me realize I'm not identical to my ego. That chattering voice in our head that accompanies us most of the time. It's kind of neurotic and can be annoying, but is useful too. I mean, your ego is what gets the book written. But I had completely separated from it, and I hadn't been annihilated. That was the amazing thing. So that, to me, was the big takeaway from this experience. There were other things that happened. I had a much happier experience with music toward the end, after constantly fighting with Mary, the name I give the guide, about her musical taste. We finally agreed, and she put on these Bach unaccompanied cello suites, which are, it's a Yo-Yo Ma recording. It's just, they're stunning and they're depressing. They're really mournful, infinitely sad pieces of music. Just a cello, nothing else. And now that I was in this non-dual state, to listen to music, I mean, those words don't describe what happens. It's to become music. You become identical with the music. And I became identical at various times with the bow, the horsehair bow, surfing over those strings of that cello. And then I went into the cello and that mouth of space, that's where all those vibrations come from, and had a total mystical merging with this piece of music. And to listen to this music now sends chills up my spine, because it wasn't Yo-Yo Ma, it wasn't Bach, it was like this universe, and I was of it. So what does that all mean? It was a powerful lesson in the role of our ego, I think, in our lives. And that's what I talked about the next day when I came back for the integration session. I said I realized that there might be another ground on which to plant our feet besides this ego, this self-interested ego. And but I didn't know what to do with it, because my ego was back on patrol, pretty quickly, doing its usual thing, keeping, my unconscious at bay and making me understand that I am me and that's somebody else, and all the stuff it does. But she said, and it was interesting, she said, well, you've had the experience of not reacting as your ego normally would, that because the ego is kind of trigger happy, right? It's defensive by definition. It marshals all your defenses, and you're supposedly in your interest, and sometimes it is in your interest. But that I'd had a taste of what it was like to not be the victim of those trigger reactions. And she said, that's something you can cultivate. And I've been cultivating it ever since. So that was, for me, that was big news. That was a big insight for me. And I think about that a lot. And I think it has, to some extent, changed my relationship to my ego. I know when he's up to his old tricks sometimes, and I can spot it, and sometimes I can put him in his place, and that's useful. Now, 30 years of psychoanalysis, you could probably get to the same place. You do a lot of work on your ego, but this I did in 4 hours or 5 hours. So that was I now look back on that as a very positive experience that taught me something important, that also gave me, it was a spiritual experience, and I'm not someone who's had a lot of them. But that merging with the music was as powerful a spiritual experience as I've had. And it also gave me a little insight into what is spiritual experience. That term has always kind of mystified me. And I think it's no different. I hate to put it in these psychodynamic terms, and I don't mean to demean anyone's more mystical understanding of it. But to me, it's mystical or spiritual experience is what happens when your ego is put aside. A spiritual experience is about a sense of merging with something larger than you. And it's your ego that stands in the way. And to the extent that you can subdue it or just put it off to the side for a few hours, amazing things happen. And you realize that you are part of a larger entity, and that the mind of Bach or Yo-Yo Ma is completely accessible to you. And that was a big deal too.
So wild. It's hard for me to even respond to that, because as you noted, and I thought you did a very masterful job of describing these experiences in the book. If one of the hallmarks of mystical experience is ineffability, it poses a quite a